I'm particularly excited about this, which is the spring's first MUSA lecture series event. We had 2 in the fall, which I thought were really great. We have 2 in the spring. So our first one here with our guest, Dr. Ted Wong, and then Eugene Brusilovsky will be doing our MUSA faculty get to know series on the 6th of April. So I have some notes about Ted and what he does and who he is, but as I bring those up, I should say, and I mentioned this for those of you who were in my class this morning, this is the person who taught me GIS 18 years ago. And he was taught GIS by the recently retired MUSA professor, Dana Tomlin. So there's a really cool circularity to all of this, which, I appreciate that moment most certainly. One of the things, sorry, while I'm bringing up Ted's bio, so I met Ted when I was an undergraduate. He was teaching at Bryn Mawr College. I was going to Haverford College and studying biology there. And like I said, he taught me GIS. But then over the years, as our paths diverged, they frequently came into contact here and there. And so Ted, we both moved away from biology somewhat and started thinking more about cities. And we both he was always a computational person. In fact, taught a class on Python, I think almost 20 years ago, which was a rarity at the time. And we found more and more and more of these convergences. And so I'm really pleased that Ted is here to come speak with us, because in some ways I think it's been a long time coming, and we've both been, and it's really cool that some of the things that I've learned from him over the years he can tell you about. So that, by way of preamble, I'll let you know that Ted is a research and project associate on the data and tools team at the World Resources Institute Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. And I'm sure Ted can tell you more, and you'll hear more about what World Resources Institute is. I think it's a very cool place for all of you to learn some about, as potentially some place to keep on your radar as you go into doing a job search, or you have a collegial relationship with other professionals going forward. So, but that being my introduction, Dr. Ted Wong.
Thank you. That was very nice. Thank you. Thank you. And I'll say this before I forget. One nice thing about World Resources Institute, WRI, is that there are a lot of internships. And many internships there turn into jobs. So it's one of those places where internships turn into jobs. The other thing is, Michael, I don't know if I ever told you this theory of mine, that when you meet like a professor or a student or somebody that you just kind of click with intellectually, I have this theory that where that comes from is that everybody has a level of abstraction that they like to think at. Some people like to keep everything really concrete. They like to be practical. They like to, keep track of how many chairs are we going to need for some event. And some people like to fly really high and be really abstract. And that when you click with somebody intellectually, very often it's because you like to think at the same level of abstraction. And that's kind of what I felt like I had with Dana Tomlin. That's what I sort of suspect is part of why you and I are friends, through in terms of the intellectual stuff. And sort of along those lines, I sort of thought that we could start with a little survey. So if you could go to menti.com, take out a phone or a laptop. Is this possible? Can you guys do this? Go to menti.com and enter this number code in there. I like to do this when there's Michael promised me a packed house, but it'll still be fun. So go to menti.com, enter that code 11287527, and if you're not a student in this program, imagine that you are. Like if you were a student, try to think back to when you were a student, and just tell me what really lit your fire intellectually in this program. And then we'll see answers. I'm not standing here like a total idiot. I'm just, waiting for the answers to appear. What's Eugene's memes? Does nobody know? I want to know.
Fun stats memes.
Okay.
I didn't write that, but that's I'm assuming it's referring. No one has written R, but a lot of people have written Python.
Did you say R? Some people like R.
No one likes R apparently. Oh wait, one person.
One person likes R. Yeah. But doesn't like it well enough to actually give it the correct. Oh no, they're all converted to lowercase. All right, you're absolved. So I guess what I see here is I see a mix of sort of people stuff and techie stuff. And the biggest thing is Python. Really, a lot of people put Python. The other big thing that came up early was analytics, and I'll tell you, when I was learning this stuff, this is when I was learning analytics and modeling and stuff. For me, it was all about the analytics, the algorithms. I loved the whole the map algebra. When I learned map algebra, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I've been in school for how many years and nobody has ever said anything about this very obvious, very versatile, useful thing. And it was just so much fun working on it. But it turns out that that the way this talk is going to be is I'm just going to tell you what my job is, and a lot of times my job is I Google stuff, and we get grants for it, and it's embarrassing, and it's not the cool analytics, right? It's not very very seldom do I get to put together a really elegant. Or even interesting. Oftentimes it's just finding data sets, and then I was putting together this talk, and I've been, I don't know about you, but I've been doom scrolling war Twitter, reading a lot about Ukraine, and there are a lot of amateur generals on Twitter, and one thing that people keep talking about these days is that what wins or loses wars is logistics. And you can think of logistics as how you get the stuff that you need from where it's made to where it's needed. And so this aligns really well with basically what we do. So this is our work at WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, and it's the work of this like a pretty big world of data providers and sort of data support organizations. And really, and I guess I want to emphasize that it's not just getting the data, and it's not just providing the data to the users, but it's providing the data in a form that they will be able to use, and that is likely to be used in the way that we want them to use it. And so that raises the question: well, what do we actually want to do? Okay, so this is my outline for today. I'm just going to tell you about what we try to get done, how we go about it, and I'm going to walk you through a few of the projects that we do. Okay, so I work at WRI. WRI is most famous for it's called Global Forest Watch. We do a lot of work with forests. There's also an ocean program, a food program, a big Bezos-funded project called Land and Carbon Lab that's about land use change and carbon sequestration in land. I work in the cities program. And what we're really interested in is how cities have been changing. So, I mean, you don't need me to tell you this, but cities have been growing. And they've been growing really quickly in certain parts of the world, but it doesn't really matter. Cities have been growing more, right now already the majority of human beings live in urban areas. And 2/3 are going to be living in urban areas by 2050, let's say 2050. But what's interesting to us is that the way that cities grow and behave economically has been changing. So in 1960 and in 2014, we can see a sort of a pretty similar, the slope is 0.02, see a similar positive relationship between urbanization on the horizontal axis and GDP, log of GDP, purchase power, parity, GDP, so a wealth measure on the vertical axis, so that the more urban a city is, typically the wealthier it is. But the tightness of the fit has changed in the last 50 years. You can sort of see that the lowest income cities are sort of clustered here, but they're kind of spread out here, so that you can be less urban or more urban and still be at the same low level of wealth. So there's kind of been this smearing out of the data. If you look at the R squared, here this slope line only accounts for half of the variance, whereas it used to be like 73%. So the way that cities are growing and accumulating wealth has been changing. If you look at how much cities, and by the way, I don't know if it's a bad habit or not, but often when you hear me say cities as the subject of a sentence, I mean local governments. And sometimes I don't mean that. So, but how much do cities spend on urban amenities, urban services? And there's a huge disparity. I mean, over here we have, cities like Yokohama and Copenhagen that have, see, how does this work? The dot is the population size, and the bar is the spending per capita. So we have these outliers. Copenhagen, even New York City, is sort of on this outlier. And then here we have these poor cities, right, where there's this huge, I don't want to call it an underspend because that seems a little judgmental, but there's a huge disparity. And what this turns into is an urban services gap. So an enormous amount of the work that city governments do for their residents is being done by the informal sector. Informal work, informal transportation, informal sewage. And that is kind of where poverty becomes public health issues and environmental issues as well. So this is kind of what we try to address. And we focus on cities because cities are the majority of the humans on Earth and the large majority of the global greenhouse gas emissions and the large proportion of the economic activity. And all this means is that there is a lot we can help, right? There's a lot of impact we can have if we focus on cities. It's a nice kind of it's like if the world is a suitcase, cities are a nice handle that you can grab onto. They concentrate your impact, and there's a lot of opportunity because we can work through investment and through the private sector, but also government investment. By the way, I tend to be kind of informal, and I welcome interruptions. So if I say anything that just doesn't make sense, if I assume something, please, is there already something?
So when you say informal sector, do you mean both the private sector and just people, starting a minibus organization between their friends so that they can get their friends from point A to point B? So
in general, I think the way that you define informality would be whether it is subject to regulation and enforcement of regulations. So if it is private sector, but still comes under regulation, then that doesn't count. And so when we complain about things like informal labor, that means that, I forget what, did I have a thing for that? I don't think I had it. Oh, employment. That we're talking about people who are working under conditions that are not, right, that are not seen by government enforcement authorities. All right, so in general, these are sort of our main domains that we try to work in. Buildings, road safety. We put out these nifty things about how to make a perfect bike lane, climate resilience. But the way that we do it is through governments. It's not the best way to do it necessarily. This is something that I tend to be critical of our organization for, is that we partner with power. We engage power because we figure that's how you have the most impact. But I mean, this is a tangent. I didn't really mean to get into this. But of course, one thing that means is that sometimes we end up reinforcing the status quo. We're not a revolutionary organization. We're not changing things systemically, although some of us try. But we work through governments. And so one thing that is really useful is to think about what is the decision-making process in a government, whom are you trying, what are the leverage points in a government. And this is a diagram from the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is a network of 10,000 cities. Philadelphia is a GCOM city. And this is what they think of as their pathway from when you join GCOM. You basically, the mayor writes a letter saying, we join GCOM. Committing to climate action in this case. GCOM is a climate action organization. And you collect data, you set targets, blah, blah, blah. So this is what GCOM thinks of as how change happens in government. And what we end up, what a lot of our focus is on is this step, is where to get the data that becomes targets and goals. So for example, in Philadelphia, okay, I don't remember the actual numbers, but transportation is a very low part of our emissions. And building energy efficiency, like heating energy efficiency, is like 70% of our emissions. So knowing that helps us to craft policies. And then another city like Houston, which has enormous transportation emissions. So it's all about finding the data that can inform policy. So what do we actually do? I mean, if we're in this dirty, dangerous, inequitable present, our general approach is to say, all right, let's come up with a framework. Let's come up with an assessment framework, an action framework, like that path that I just showed you. That's GCOM's idea of the framework for how you think about change. And then we identify and fill gaps with data. My part is data. Like I work in the data part of the cities program. And so that's what I'll be talking to you about, is how we think about frameworks and gaps. These are some of the projects that we're working on. I'm going to talk about a few of them. But what counts as a framework sometimes is a formal framework. Well, like in this case, it's a reporting protocol. GCOM says, you join GCOM, we're going to make you report certain kind of data to us. And then they figure if cities are reporting those data, then they're finding out stuff. And when they're finding out stuff, then they can write a good plan. So that's their framework. Sometimes it's actual analyses. Sometimes it's sort of more academic than that. But in general, once we have that framework, then we can sort of figure out what is the nature of the data that we're going to provide to fill the gaps. Some of you might be interested in what tech we use. I really like to use Google Earth Engine and Jupyter Notebooks, Python. I use Python and Earth Engine. Other parts of WRI, like the Global Forest Watch people, they do a lot of stuff in Amazon Cloud. And I don't really know how to talk to them. But if any of you are interested in Earth Engine, I'm a huge fan. And sometimes we use R, and I use QGIS instead of ARC because I don't know who to talk to about getting a license in our office. I'm sure other people use ARC, but I'm just sitting on my laptop at my home office. I'm like, I can just download QGIS without calling anybody, and it works just fine, right? So. Okay, so the first project is something called the Data Portal for Cities. It's a partnership between WRI and the Global Covenant of Mayors, GCOM. It started out like 5 years ago as this tool that provides what we call activity data to cities. Activity data is energy consumption and waste production data that results in emissions. The classic framework that cities use to do climate change mitigation planning, that is decarbonization planning, is called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Cities, the GPC. And it's basically a greenhouse gas accounting framework. It says you figure out everything that is creating emissions, and you quantify them, and you add them up, and then you know how much is emitting what. So it's very hard. I mean, it's very expensive and very hard to collect data on how much heating oil is sold in a city, how much gasoline is used, how much electricity is used for trains, how much electricity is used in airports. You know, it gets very detailed. And so what we do is we provide lower quality data that's been downscaled from national and regional data sets. So this is the recurring theme, is that we find public, free data and then convert it into forms that decision makers can use. And very often it is lower quality data than a city would be able to get themselves if they had the resources to get the data themselves from like local data collection efforts. So that's kind of what we do, is we we give people lower quality data, but data that is good enough to get them on the path to decarbonization. The project that for GCOM that we've been working on lately is this Adaptation Tool, and it provides data on what climate hazards are important in a city and which urban assets are exposed to those hazards. So this is the exposure tool. I didn't create this. My colleague Saif did. But it uses, oh, you know what, I have a. So the data come from Landsat, land surface temperature, OpenStreetMap for where are the hospitals, schools, police stations that are these dots, and WorldPop, which is a nice global data set that's a spatial population data set that's based on basically models. And the idea is that we can help cities sort of identify which sectors and which particular assets are most exposed. Here's the hazard data, and the nifty thing here, and the data here come from climate simulations. This is a landslide project that NASA runs, and Copernicus is a European satellites, and our flooding modeling tool, Aqueduct. And what's cool about this is two things. I show people this. And they don't see what's cool about this, but you're going to see what's cool about this. There's two things. One thing that's cool about it is that it's based on indicators. So a lot of the data that's out there tells you things like the temperature or how much rain. And sort of one of our insights was that it's actually these derived variables, these indicators, that are going to be more meaningful for city decision makers. It's going to be more meaningful to stakeholders to think about, not how hot is it going to be, but how many heat waves are there going to be, or how hot are the nights going to be if you're concerned about the public health effects of urban heat islands. So that's thing one, is a focus on indicators. Thing two that's cool is the probabilistic approach. So what we can do is we can say, what's the probability that the number of heat waves in 2060 is greater than 6 in a year? And so what that allows us to do is it allows us to plug straight into things like insurance models and engineering models, things that are already kind of structured around probabilities. And somebody was asking me recently, what do you say to city decision makers, like an engineering department, that says, well, I just want to know what the climate is going to be like. And you want to answer them, but you want to be honest about the level of uncertainty. And usually these people, I think of them as these data consumers. They don't care about the uncertainty. They just want a number. They want to know how hot is it going to be. And the nice thing about this combining probabilities and indicators is it lets you flip the question around, not flip it around, but it lets you turn the question a little bit. and say, well, instead of telling you how hot it's going to be, let me ask you, how hot do you care about? What are the critical temperatures, precipitation levels, number of heat waves, number of frost days? What are the ones that you care about? And I can tell you how likely that is. And that lets you be honest about uncertainty without hitting people over the head. But it also lets you give them a real number that they can probably plug into their actual models. So we're probably going to be applying this to a project on agricultural supply chains, where we can start with indicators that are defined for crop physiology. We can say, oh, rice can't be stored at higher than 85% humidity. So that's your number. That's the critical number. How probable is 85% humidity in a particular place? So we start with crop-relevant indicators, and we find the probability that these indicators exceed particular thresholds, and that gives us probabilities of crop failures and crop losses. And then we can combine these to give an overall estimate of crop failure probability. And actually, you don't have to see that. I'm pitching this approach to somebody tomorrow, and people love maps. They always want to know, what does the outputs look like? I don't want to see a table of numbers like you showed me 2 slides ago. I want to see the maps. All right. Urban Shift. Urban Shift, I'm shifting gears now. It's a different project. Urban Shift is a project that is, it's in collaboration with a bunch of organizations, mostly the UN Environment Program. And it's to provide support to a bunch of cities, 23 cities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America for integrated urban planning in general. And so it's a huge project. So the part that's, I'm going to show you 2 parts of it. And one of them is our project on providing data for urban expansion. So this is a pilot report that we produced. So we provided this to Freetown, Sierra Leone. Freetown, Sierra Leone asked for information about what are the zones with, with high urban expansion. And we produced this sort of interactive HTML report that basically tells them where our data come from and how we did it. So this is based on a really simple machine learning exercise. We looked at aerial photos of Freetown and chose 53. I wasn't part of that. I don't know why they decided on 53. 53 locations to code as either urban or non-urban, and they used that to train a random forest classifier, and so we can say something like, this is what the land looked like, the urban, non-urban distribution looked like in 2016. This is what it looked like in 2021, and here are the hot spots. Here's when we just do a difference. This is what that looks like. We showed this to them. They said, actually, we want different administrative boundaries. We want to know, we want ward level, we want planning districts, and so, after some back and forth with the Freetown City Council, we provided them with this. This is kind of a fun story because they liked this a lot, and they ended up taking this report and presenting it themselves to I forget what they're called, but it's the local organization that deals with slum improvement with informal settlements. And they've been using these maps to prioritize which parts of the city to focus their slum improvement efforts in. Whoops, yeah, sorry. And the main discussion now is whether we have to what are the land use categories, land use categories that their government uses, and whether we can accommodate those categories in our analysis. All right. The next project is a biodiversity project, and it's also based on a report. So a lot of cities asked for support in doing urban biodiversity planning. Mostly that's things like green space planning and I have a lot of theories, and one of my theories is that, you know, the big organizations that were the big environmental organizations of the 80s and 90s were biodiversity organizations. You know, WWF, the Nature Conservancy, and they left their mark, and we weren't expecting it, but all the urban shift cities except one, you know, we told them what we were going to provide to them. It didn't include biodiversity, but they all came back and said, we have to, you know, all right, so we're interested in biodiversity. The framework that we're using here is called the Singapore Index. It was developed by the city of Singapore and ICLEI. Do you know ICLEI? ICLEI is an organization of local governments for sustainability. It stands for something, but it doesn't stand for it in English, and so I don't really remember how, you know, how ICLEI means that. So the way that the Singapore Index works is that there are a set of indicators, things like the proportion of natural areas in a city, the connectivity one. So those of you who are interested in analytics, the way their connectivity measure works. So biodiversity conservationists are interested in habitat connectivity, because if an animal is able to move from a habitat patch to another habitat patch to another habitat patch, then it kind of, the set of habitat patches can behave like it's a large patch of habitat. And so there's a connectivity measure that involves taking all the habitat patches, imagining that they're expanded by an amount, seeing if that expansion causes them to. So it ends up being a measure of how hard it is for an animal to disperse between patches. But anyway, there's a set of indicators that includes species observations. It includes the percent of area that's built up instead of natural. And we assembled a bunch of data. We Googled, I Googled where to find the different data. And we use a combination of crowdsourced data from iNaturalist to figure out where birds, vascular plants, and arthropods are in a city. And of course, there are issues with that, and we can talk about that. I say this because Michael had this look on his face, like, what? And OpenStreetMap for urban amenities that address the recreational and public health benefits of nature in a city. And a lot of data that is basically land use classification from satellite data. And so, you know, we're able to support basically half of the indicators in the Singapore Index can be supported by these public data that we found. The rest of it is stuff that we just cannot support. The rest of it is things like what percent of your city budget is devoted to biodiversity, you know, how many, you know, like how many programs are there. But so these maps are the different municipalities in metropolitan San Jose, Costa Rica. And for each one, we're able to say something like, you know, what percent, actually that's not it yet, hang on. All right, so here's indicator one, what percent, like the percent that is natural area based on a land use classification. We can show the raw data per municipality, or we can show the numerical score, you know, according to the mapping that exists in the Singapore Index. All right. I was going to skip over how we do the crowdsourced species, but I'll just, for those of you who are interested, the problem with crowdsourced species observations, of course, is that there are going to be some places in a city where there's some hobbyist who loves birds, and that person lives there, and every time she steps into her front yard, she sees like 6 more birds, and then just because of the distribution of amateur naturalists, that will skew the spatial distribution of observations. Also, for some taxa, for some kinds of organisms, there are a lot more people who can identify birds than can identify beetles. And the Singapore Index has an indicator for arthropods, which are insects and spiders and anyway, so the Singapore Index was created. The idea is that a city would work with local universities, local nature organizations, and organize a species survey. So we can't really do that. And again, what we're doing is we're providing lower quality data. So when you do a species survey, this is called a species accumulation curve. The more work you put into it, the more hours you spend looking for new species, the more, usually it's the more hours you have. If you count how many unique species have been found, in the beginning, every time you see something, it's a new species. It's not on the list yet in the beginning. But as you move along time, you start to get repeats. And so we take basically, if you try to figure out where this asymptotes out to, where this kind of flattens out, this is a good estimate for how many species there are. And what we do is we take the observations in iNaturalist. We use, iNaturalist has different grades of data. We use what are called research grade data. And we use each observation as a unit of effort. Then we calculate this curve. We randomize the order of observations. We find where it curves out. Then we re-randomize it. We find where it curves, where it flattens out. We do that 100 times. We average it, and that's our estimate for how many species. And then in 5 years' time, the idea is you do the same thing again, and maybe you see a change in the species diversity. Okay. I guess that was it for that. All right. So that's it for the projects, the specific projects that I wanted to talk about. And so here's some kind of general observations about sort of problems that we often see. So one problem, of course, is that we can provide data. We can provide data and a really great framework for how to turn the data into action. But very often, the data infrastructure in a city government is kind of separated from the actual decision making in the city government. The budgeting, the long-term planning, like the capital planning, very often can be motivated by political considerations. You hear occasionally about some mayor went to a conference and came back all excited about bus rapid transit or something. And when we talk to city governments, we interviewed a bunch of city governments a couple of years ago, and it was a decarbonization project, and we asked, all right, you collect all the data, you collect all the activity data, you do the greenhouse gas inventory, what do you do with it? And almost to a one, they said, oh, we put it into a report, and sometimes the city council will ask to see it, but mostly they'll just ask for a poster, like a big visualization. So it doesn't really go into the kind of process that we would like to see happen, which is that the data actually inform the decisions. So we're not good at this yet, but the way that we're thinking about how to overcome this problem is that, is that we provide the data in a format that is easily inserted directly into decision-making processes. Directly inserted into cost-benefit analyses, directly inserted into the decision-making workflows that actually do have power in a city. So often these are going to be things like air quality, public health. These are kinds of decision-making domains that have a lot of influence in a city. And we try to figure out how to provide the data in a form that's easily digested by those workflows. It raises a new challenge, which is, every city is so different, and the political contexts are so very different from city to city. So it's kind of hard to think about how. I don't know if you noticed, but basically everything that I showed you is about taking global data sets, using global rasters, processing global rasters, turning them into sort of these, just taking a one world approach to it all. And And customizing things for particular city political contexts is something that we haven't really wrapped our head around how to think about yet. Capacity building. So Freetown, I mentioned Freetown, Sierra Leone. When we first talked to them, we asked, well, what do you think is your data analytic capacity? And they said, oh, we don't even have a GIS office. So we don't really know how we're going to, what we will do with whatever data you provide to us. It's compounded by this problem, which is that everybody who works in the city government there, most of them are consultants. And most of them will leave when the mayor leaves. And so if we were to build capacity, analytic capacity, if we were to provide training in using GIS, that capacity would leave in a few years. So that's a challenge. That's kind of annoying. But this is kind of this thing that we run into a lot, which is that we like our tech, and we can kind of fall in love with the kind of cool stuff that we are able to produce, but really cities don't want that. A lot of the cities that we deal with don't want that, and so we're always reminding ourselves we fill the gaps durably. We fill the gaps with bridges that the people are able to step on, and this is something that I've been kind of on a soapbox a lot on at work, is that often lower quality data is fine. I mean, if you think about decarbonization, there's not that many things that you get to choose from when you're trying to figure out how to decarbonize your city. You improve public transit, you improve insulation, you get people out of their cars and you get them into buildings that don't leak heat. And if you do those two things, you're most of the way there. So it's not really important to get the highest quality, highest precision data you can about energy consumption in the different sectors. All you need is a ballpark. All you need is, well, anyway, I have a whole abstract metaphor that I will spare you. And finally, we at WRI sort of want cities to save the world, and then the cities, they're like, we need to look after our residents, and we get that, that's fine, and so what we focus on is the strategies that, of course, can do everything. And the nice thing is that for the most part, that's easy. For the most part, the things that people care about are air quality, disaster mitigation, traffic congestion, and economic growth. And for the most part, not everything. I mean, economic growth is the hard one. But for the most part, these different concerns pull sort of in the same direction, and the same strategies can work for them. Okay, that's it. And I'm happy to answer questions, but now, I'm happy to answer questions now, but also I invite you to get in touch with me if you just want to send me a question or something. Yeah.
You mentioned about the gap between providing the city with your data analysis report, and I just wonder how many of those cities who got the report actually make actions that based on recommendations to actually make a change.
This is new. This is new. Yeah, this approach is new. We've only 100%. Because we've only given one of these reports to Freetown, Sierra Leone, and they did use it to try to work out how to prioritize their slum improvement efforts. It's funny. A lot of cities say, well, we want a dashboard, or they say we want a bunch of maps and stuff. And this is something we're experimenting with. providing these HTML reports that are a little bit interactive, and so far, I mean, yeah. So that's a new thing for us. We don't know. Yeah.
So you mentioned that WRI is working with different governments. I assume that those governments are mostly sub-national governments, but I know that sometimes the struggle between the national governments and sub-national governments would really hinder the progress of social policy, just making that forward. So I'm wondering if WRI is also working with national governments in those programs.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So WRI, the whole institute, mostly works with national governments. So the cities program is different, but the forest program, the oceans program, food program, they mostly work with national governments. A lot of the funding comes from national governments. And in the cities program, it's still the case that a lot of funding comes from national governments. And so the work that we do with city governments is the work that the national governments approve of. So usually we don't run into those kinds of conflicts. And even when that's not the case, that the funding has come from the national government. So for example, the work through the Global Covenant of Mayors, we work with the Global Covenant of Mayors rather than working directly with the governments. And in general, all of the actions that GCOM recommends to the cities, there's always like a section in the document that is about integrating with different levels of government. Because often the funding will still come from the national level, or often the national policies constrain what activities are available to the city. This is something we see in Mexico, that when we work with city governments in Mexico, they have a limited number of actions that are available to them, and they come from a nationally distributed set of acceptable actions. So we do work within the national context. Yeah.
So kind of a follow-up question. The most fundings are from the national government, or do you also work with other multilateral banks to get the fundings?
I think in general, I don't really know for sure, but I think in general we don't get a lot of projects funded from multilateral banks. Maybe a few, but for the most part the funding comes from national governments, either for work within their own country or through like a foreign aid agency that's funding global work, or it comes from large foundations. Like the new Bezos Earth Fund just gave WRI a bunch of money for electrifying school buses in the United States and for this land use carbon sequestration project. So.
When you're looking at these global data sets, I mean, you can kind of start to discern like where your work would maybe be most impactful. And is that like part of the consideration too in terms of like how you would go out and maybe get projects or work with certain governments? So kind of like a outbound rather than inbound.
Yeah, I had this long conversation with. Okay, so I went down this rabbit hole of thinking about large cities versus small cities, and where do we have a greater impact? Because large cities have larger emissions but lower per capita emissions, and also large cities tend to have the most capacity. It's not always the case, but C40 cities, which is sometimes a partner of ours, C40 cities, they are an organization they're a network of 90 megacities. So they're like New York and Los Angeles and Singapore. And what WRI tends to look at second-tier cities. So we're still looking at large, high-emitting cities, but ones that don't have as much capacity. And so the question about how we like choose where to work, yeah, it tends to be a combination of where is there funding for, but but we are interested in where we think that there could be a lot of impact. But the thing is, you know, I don't know if that comes from looking at data. You know, I mean, that might be like that mayor looking at the Hyperloop thing, is that that sometimes I think it's that our directors are working on their intuition. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I kind of feel like the way that people think is that the number of cities that could use our help is much larger than the number of cities that we can help. So anywhere that we can help is still, you know, worthwhile. Yes.
Oh, yeah. I wonder if if WRI is engaged in longitudinal analysis of like several years, like, and if you guys like review the data and make sure that the observations coming in match with the models and like how you can do that.
Wow, you know, I mean, that would be great, and I think I mean, there's a whole M&E department that's within the research part of WRI, and the problem is that the way that our funding tends to work, it tends to be very project based, and so, you know, there's funding for 5 years, and then there's not funding, there is a move within WRI to try to write more monitoring and evaluation into the grants, and into sort of a more long-term cycle of feedback, but it is not something that we have done well. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a specific question about the urban heat wave project you just introduced. So what kind of conclusion do you get from that research, and what advice do you give to the company?
Huh. No. It's funny. We don't. It's funny. I think the way that we think about that project is we create this data tool, and then cities find out the information for themselves. We have not gone through and done sort of an analysis of the data for ourselves. It's not part of the funding, yeah, it just hasn't been on our radar. That's kind of an odd thing on our side. Yeah.
I was curious too about how like internet access affects your work. Just, you know.
No, that's a really good question, and it's, you know, it's funny. I did this this study of the software tools, the data and analytical tools that city decision makers use for decarbonization planning. And, you know, there's this world of web tools out there, and the web tools tend to be these one-stop shops where they provide activity data. They basically do all the work for you, all the way through providing you with comms materials. And then there's this, but those only work in Europe and North America, and they require money because running a web application requires constant updating and maintenance. And then this is the much larger world of analytical tools that are basically just Excel spreadsheets with a lot of formulas already in them. And these are the main tools out there. C40 Cirrus tool and the World Bank's Curb tool are like the most used greenhouse gas inventory tools out there. And they're just Excel. They're Excel calculators that are written actually in Excel. And of course, that has advantages. One advantage is once you download it, you can use it. You can use it forever. If you build a workflow around it and you train people to use it, and these things do require training because they tend to be very complex tools, then you can just use that. And you don't have to worry, like if C40 comes up with an updated version, you don't have to use it. And it works even if you have intermittent internet access. So cities that have worse internet, oh, and also those tools tend to be free. Cities, a lot of cities, that's what they use, and it kind of sucks for them because, you know, there's an enormous amount of data that they have to find and input, and these greenhouse gas inventory processes are really cumbersome. But that's what they do. They use these offlineable tools. Yeah.
Hello, I really enjoy learning about WRI's different projects, and as you know, it's very important to gather data before you do any kind of analysis. So I'm just curious about, you listed many public data sources. I'm just curious about, does WRI have its own database or own data, something like raw data? Or do you cooperate with some private data owners and pay for them?
Yeah, so in general, by the way, there is a nice resource that WRI maintains. It's called resourcewatch. And resourcewatch is a nice store of spatial data for all sorts of domains. But very little of it is data that WRI collected. There's one tool called Aqueduct that is a modeling project that looks at all kinds of water risk, flooding, drought, eutrophication, all sorts of water-related risks. And there are some other tools that have to do with water. There's a global security and water tool. But for the most part, no, we don't have our own data. We sort of create pipelines between data that's provided by like NASA or these other large projects and the users. And so that's why I think of what we do as like logistics. Is that we're not the people who are creating the material. We're sort of connecting the end users with the material. Yeah. Sure.
I think we're about time. We're until 6, but I wanted to thank Ted, but I also want to especially thank you for showing folks how far you can go in life with markdown documents.
Yeah. Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah.
I also think that Google Earth Engine is a really cool tool. Has anybody in this room worked with Google Earth Engine before? A few folks? Awesome. I think that something like that, you can see how this type of thing is possible. But I think I have so many questions that we could stay here for I don't know how long to learn about all these different tools. But I want to thank Ted, and I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. And we have like I said, we have our next lecture, same time, same place on April 6th with Eugene Groot's Laws. So let's hear for Ted.
Thank you. It was fun. Thanks.